The sprawling mansion of the Blackwood estate stood like a sentinel against the fading light of dusk. Its manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges spoke of wealth and meticulous care, a testament to the life Jonathan Blackwood had built for himself and his beloved wife, Helena. Jonathan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, swirling a glass of aged scotch as he gazed out at the setting sun. At 45, he was the picture of success, salt and pepper hair expertly styled, his tailored suit hugging his still athletic frame. He had everything a man could want: a thriving business empire, a beautiful wife, and a life of luxury that most could only dream of. As he took a sip of his drink, Jonathan allowed himself a small smile. It had been 15 years since he'd married Helena, and their life together had been nothing short of perfect. She was his rock, his confidant, and the love of his life. Or so he thought. The sudden chime of the doorbell echoed through the vast halls of the mansion, pulling Jonathan from his reverie. He frowned, glancing at his watch. It was nearly 8 p.m., far too late for any scheduled visitors. Curiosity piqued, he set down his glass and made his way to the foyer. "I'll get it, darling," Helena's melodious voice called out from somewhere in the house. Jonathan paused, listening to the click of her heels on the marble floor as she approached the massive oak door. As Helena opened the door, Jonathan heard her gasp. Concerned, he quickened his pace, rounding the corner just as Helena stumbled backward, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost. And then, Jonathan saw her. Time seemed to stop as he locked eyes with the woman standing in the doorway. His heart thundered in his chest, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The woman before him was the spitting image of his wife. The same cascading dark hair, the same piercing green eyes, the same delicate features. But there was something different about her, something hauntingly familiar that sent a jolt of recognition through his entire being. "Sophie?" Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman's eyes welled with tears as she nodded, a trembling smile forming on her lips. "Hello, Jonathan. It's been a long time." Jonathan's world tilted on its axis. Sophie, his first love, the woman he had believed dead for the past 17 years. The woman whose loss had nearly destroyed him. The woman whose identical twin he had married. Helena's voice, sharp with disbelief and a hint of fear, cut through the shocked silence. "This isn't possible. You died. We buried you." Sophie's gaze never left Jonathan's as she spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "I'm very much alive, sister. And I've come back to claim what's rightfully mine." The tension in the air was palpable as Jonathan stood frozen between the two identical women, his wife and the ghost from his past. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible scenario unfolding before him. "I don't understand," Jonathan finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. How are you here? We were told there was an accident, a fire." Sophie's eyes clouded with pain as she took a step into the foyer. "It's a long story, Jonathan. One that I've waited 17 years to tell you." Helena moved closer to Jonathan, her hand gripping his arm possessively. "Whatever story you have to tell, you can do it somewhere else. You're not welcome here." "Helena," Jonathan said softly, placing his hand over hers. He could feel her trembling, and despite his own shock, he felt a surge of protectiveness toward his wife. "Let's hear her out. We owe her that much." Sophie's eyes flickered between Jonathan and Helena, a mix of emotions playing across her face: hope, sadness, and something darker that Jonathan couldn't quite place. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan nodded, ignoring Helena's sharp intake of breath. As Sophie stepped into the mansion, the air seemed to crackle with unspoken tension and long-buried secrets. Leading them to the opulent living room, Jonathan's mind whirled with questions. How had Sophie survived? Where had she been all these years? And why, after all this time, had she chosen to return now? As they settled onto the plush sofas, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the room. Helena sat rigidly next to Jonathan, her knuckles white as she gripped his hand. Sophie perched on the edge of an armchair, her eyes darting nervously around the room before settling back on Jonathan. "I suppose I owe you both an explanation," Sophie began, her voice trembling slightly. It's not an easy story to tell, and I'm not proud of everything that's happened. But you deserve to know the truth. Jonathan leaned forward, his heart pounding. We're listening, Sophie. Please, tell us everything. Sophie took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Jonathan's with an intensity that made his breath catch. It all started the night of the fire, she began. The night everyone thought I died. As Sophie's tale unfolded, Jonathan felt as if he were being pulled back in time. He remembered that night vividly, the frantic phone call, the mad dash to the burning cabin, the gut-wrenching despair when they couldn't find Sophie in the wreckage. It had been the worst night of his life, a night that had changed everything. I wasn't in the cabin when the fire started, Sophie revealed, her voice barely above a whisper. I had gone for a walk to clear my head. We had argued earlier that day, remember? Jonathan nodded, the memory flooding back. They had been planning their wedding, but a disagreement about the guest list had escalated into a full-blown fight. He had stormed off, telling Sophie he needed some space. It was the last time he had seen her, until now. When I came back, the cabin was engulfed in flames, Sophie continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I saw you there, Jonathan, searching for me, calling my name. I was about to run to you when... She paused, her gaze shifting to Helena, who sat stone-faced beside Jonathan. When I saw my sister comforting you, the way she held you, the look in her eyes, I knew in that moment that she was in love with you. Helena's sharp intake of breath cut through the room. That's ridiculous, she snapped. I was comforting my sister's fiancé who thought he had lost her. How dare you twist that moment into something sordid? Is it really so ridiculous, Helena? Sophie countered, her voice gaining strength. You always wanted what was mine. My toys, my clothes, my friends, and finally, my fiancé. Jonathan felt as if he were watching a tennis match, his head swiveling between the two identical women as they faced off. The tension in the room was suffocating, years of unspoken rivalry and resentment bubbling to the surface. That still doesn't explain where you've been all these years, Jonathan interjected, trying to steer the conversation back on track. Why didn't you come forward? Why let us believe you were dead? Sophie's expression softened as she turned back to Jonathan. I was scared and confused. Seeing Helena with you, I panicked. I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me, that Helena could make you happier than I ever could. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. So I ran. I left everything behind and started a new life under a different name. But I never stopped loving you, Jonathan. Not for a single day. The weight of Sophie's words hung heavy in the air. Jonathan felt as if the ground beneath him had suddenly become unstable, everything he thought he knew about his life and his relationships thrown into question. Helena's voice, cold and controlled, broke the silence. A convenient story, but where's your proof? How do we know you're really Sophie and not some imposter trying to con your way into our lives? Sophie reached into her bag, pulling out a small, weathered journal. I kept this all these years, she said, holding it out to Jonathan. It's the journal you gave me on our first anniversary. Remember the inscription? With trembling hands, Jonathan took the journal. He opened it to the first page, and there, in his own handwriting, were the words he had penned so many years ago. To my dearest Sophie, may our love story fill these pages and last a lifetime. Forever yours, Jonathan. He looked up, his eyes meeting Sophie's, and in that moment, he knew without a doubt that she was telling the truth. This was his Sophie, the woman he had loved and lost, now miraculously returned to him. It really is you, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Helena stood abruptly, her face a mask of fury and fear. This is insane. You can't possibly believe this fairy tale, Jonathan. She abandoned you, let you believe she was dead for 17 years, and now she waltzes back into our lives expecting everything to be forgiven? Helena, please, Jonathan said, reaching for his wife's hand. But Helena jerked away, her eyes flashing with hurt and betrayal. No, Jonathan, I won't stand here and watch you fall for her lies. I'm your wife. We've built a life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Before Jonathan could respond, Sophie stood as well, her posture mirroring Helena's. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Helena. I'm asking for a chance to explain, to make things right. The two women faced each other, identical in appearance but worlds apart in their intentions. Jonathan felt torn between them, his heart and mind waging a war he never thought he'd have to fight. As the clock in the hallway chimed 9, Jonathan realized that in the span of a single hour, his entire world had been turned upside down. The life he thought he knew, the love he thought he understood, it was all suddenly cast in a new, uncertain light. "Ladies," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "It's clear we have a lot to discuss. But it's late, and we're all emotional. Perhaps it would be best if we continued this conversation tomorrow, after we've had a chance to process everything." Helena's eyes flashed with betrayal. "You want her to stay? In our home? We have plenty of guest rooms," Jonathan replied, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "It's the least we can do, given the circumstances." Sophie nodded gratefully, while Helena's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Jonathan alone with the woman he had once loved, and lost. As the sound of Helena's footsteps faded, Jonathan turned to Sophie, his mind reeling with questions and conflicting emotions. "I'll show you to a guest room," he said softly. "We have a lot to talk about, Sophie. A lot to figure out." Sophie nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Thank you, Jonathan. I know this is a shock, and I'm sorry for turning your life upside down. But I promise you, by the time I'm done telling you everything, you'll understand why I had to come back." As Jonathan led Sophie up the grand staircase, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life would never be the same again. The ghost of his past had returned, bringing with her a storm of emotions and unanswered questions. In the quiet of the night, as three hearts beat with fear, hope, and uncertainty, the Blackwood mansion held its breath, waiting for the dawn that would bring with it the promise of revelations and the potential for both heartbreak and redemption. Little did Jonathan know that Sophie's return was just the beginning of a tale that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and forgiveness. A tale that would force him to confront the ghosts of his past and make a choice that would alter the course of his future forever. The first light of dawn crept through the ornate curtains of the Blackwood mansion, finding Jonathan slumped in his study chair. He hadn't slept a wink, his mind a tempest of memories and questions. The empty tumbler on his desk bore witness to his futile attempts to numb the shock of Sophie's return. As he rubbed his tired eyes, a soft knock on the door made him straighten. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from the long night. Helena entered, her usual impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, dark circles under her eyes betraying her own sleepless night. She approached Jonathan slowly, as if afraid he might disappear. "Jonathan," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk about her." He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. As she perched on the edge of the leather sofa, Jonathan couldn't help but notice how different she looked from the confident, composed woman he'd known for 15 years. The arrival of her long-lost twin had shaken her to the core. "Helena," he said softly, "I know this is difficult. It's surreal for me too. But we need to hear Sophie out. We owe her that much." Helena's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Owe her? Jonathan, she let us believe she was dead for 17 years. She abandoned you, abandoned us all. How can you be so calm about this?" Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'm not calm, Helena. I don't even know what I am. Shocked, confused, angry, relieved. It's all a jumble. But the fact remains, Sophie is alive, and she's here. We need to understand why." A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Finally, Helena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you still in love with her?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Jonathan felt his heart constrict. How could he answer when he wasn't sure himself? "Helena," he began, choosing his words carefully, "Sophie was a huge part of my life. When I thought she died, it nearly destroyed me. You know that. You were there. You helped me pick up the pieces." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "What we've built together over the past 15 years is real. Our love, our life. It's not something that can be erased overnight. Helena's grip tightened on his hand, her eyes searching his face. But it can be questioned, can't it? Now that she's back. Before Jonathan could respond, another knock interrupted them. The door opened slowly, revealing Sophie, looking as lost and uncertain as they felt. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said softly. I couldn't sleep, and I heard voices. I thought maybe we could talk." Jonathan nodded, gesturing for her to join them. As Sophie settled into an armchair across from them, the air in the room became thick with unspoken words and buried emotions. "I owe you both an explanation," Sophie began, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "The full story of where I've been and why I stayed away for so long." Helena's posture stiffened, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on her identical twin. Sophie took a deep breath and began her tale. "The night of the fire, I had gone for a walk to clear my head after our argument, Jonathan. When I came back and saw the cabin in flames, I panicked. I saw you both there, searching for me, and for a moment, I was going to run to you." Her eyes clouded with pain as she continued. "But then I saw how Helena was comforting you, Jonathan. The look in her eyes. I knew she loved you. And in that moment, all my insecurities came rushing back." She turned to Helena, her voice softening. "You were always the confident one, Helena. The one who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. I was always in your shadow, always second best. Seeing you with Jonathan, I convinced myself that you could make him happier than I ever could." Helena's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, guilt, and a flicker of something that looked almost like understanding. "So I ran," Sophie continued, her voice breaking. "I left everything behind and started a new life under a different name. I told myself it was for the best, that you'd both be happier without me." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "But why stay away for so long, Sophie? Why let us believe you were dead?" Sophie's eyes met his, brimming with unshed tears. "At first, it was fear and shame. I couldn't face what I'd done, the pain I'd caused. And as time went on, it became harder and harder to find a way back. How could I explain my absence? How could I ask for forgiveness after so many years?" She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "But I never stopped thinking about you, Jonathan. About the life we could have had. I tried to move on, even married someone else, but it never felt right. When my husband died last year, I realized I couldn't live with the lie anymore. I had to come back, to face the truth, no matter the consequences." The room fell silent as Sophie's words hung in the air. Jonathan felt as if he were being torn in two, his heart aching for the woman he had loved and lost, while his mind struggled to reconcile her actions with the life he had built with Helena. Helena was the first to break the silence, her voice cold and controlled. "A convenient story, but where's your proof? How do we know this isn't some elaborate con?" Sophie reached into her bag, pulling out a small, ornate locket. "Do you remember this, Jonathan? You gave it to me on our first anniversary." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the delicate piece of jewelry. With trembling hands, he took the locket, opening it to reveal a tiny photograph of himself and Sophie, young and in love, their whole lives ahead of them. "I've kept it all these years," Sophie said softly. "It was my one connection to the life I left behind." As Jonathan stared at the photograph, memories flooded back. The day he had given Sophie the locket, their plans for the future, the love that had seemed unbreakable. He looked up, his eyes meeting Sophie's, and in that moment, he knew without a doubt that she was telling the truth. Helena watched the exchange, her face a mask of pain and fear. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice tight. "We have a life together, Jonathan. 15 years of marriage, of building a future. You can't throw that away for a ghost from the past." Jonathan felt torn between the two women, his past and his present colliding in a way he never thought possible. "I'm not throwing anything away, Helena," he said softly. "But we can't ignore this. Sophie is alive, and we need to figure out what that means for all of us." Sophie leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "I'm not here to destroy your life, Jonathan. Or yours, Helena. I needed you to know the truth. To understand why I did what I did, even if you can't forgive me for it." The tension in the room was palpable as the three of them sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts and emotions. Jonathan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation he found himself in. On one side sat Helena, his wife of 15 years, the woman who had helped him rebuild his life after Sophie's supposed death. She had been his rock, his partner in every sense of the word. Their life together was comfortable, secure, built on a foundation of shared experiences and mutual respect. On the other side was Sophie, his first love, the woman he had mourned for so long. Her return had awakened feelings he thought long buried, stirring up memories of a passionate, all-consuming love that had once defined his world. As the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the room, Jonathan realized that the choice before him was impossible. How could he choose between the life he had built and the love he had lost? How could he trust his own heart when it seemed to be pulling him in two different directions? "We need time," he finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "This isn't something we can resolve in one morning. We all need to process this, to figure out what it means for each of us." Helena nodded stiffly, while Sophie's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and resignation. "I understand," Sophie said softly. "I know I've caused chaos by coming back. I'll go, give you both space to talk." As she stood to leave, Jonathan found himself reaching out, catching her hand. "No," he said, surprising even himself. "Stay, please. We need to face this together, all of us." Helena's sharp intake of breath was audible, but she didn't protest. Jonathan turned to her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Helena, I know this is hard. But Sophie is your sister. Whatever else has happened, that hasn't changed. We need to deal with this as a family." The word family seemed to hang in the air, its meaning suddenly complex and fraught with tension. Helena's eyes flickered between Jonathan and Sophie, a storm of emotions playing across her face. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight. "But I want answers. Real answers, not just convenient excuses." Sophie nodded, sinking back into her chair. "I'll tell you everything," she promised. "No more secrets, no more lies." As the three of them settled in for what promised to be a long and emotionally charged conversation, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that his entire world was balancing on a knife's edge. The truth that was about to be revealed had the power to heal or destroy, to bring them together or tear them apart forever. Little did he know that Sophie's return was just the beginning of a tale that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and forgiveness. A tale that would force him to confront the ghosts of his past and make a choice that would alter the course of his future forever. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its unforgiving light on the three figures in the study, Jonathan braced himself for revelations that would shake the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the power of long-buried secrets to resurface and change lives forever. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon, its resonant tones echoing through the tense silence of Jonathan's study. For hours, the three of them had been locked in conversation, peeling back layers of secrets and lies that had accumulated over nearly 2 decades. Sophie sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her voice hoarse from talking. "After I left that night, I wandered for weeks, lost and alone. I ended up in a small town on the coast, where nobody knew me. That's where I met David." Jonathan felt a twinge in his chest at the mention of another man's name. Despite the years and everything that had happened, the thought of Sophie with someone else still had the power to affect him. "David was kind," Sophie continued, her eyes distant with memory. "He offered me a job at his bookstore, gave me a place to stay. Over time, we grew close, and eventually, we married." Helena's voice cut through the room, sharp with barely contained anger. "So you built a whole new life while we mourned you? While Jonathan nearly drank himself to death with grief?" Sophie flinched at the accusation in her sister's words. "I know it sounds terrible. But I convinced myself it was for the best. That you and Jonathan would be happy together, that my death had brought you closer." Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But why, Sophie? Why not just tell me the truth? Did you think I wouldn't understand?" Sophie's eyes met his, brimming with unshed tears. "I was scared, Jonathan. Scared of facing what I'd done, scared of your rejection. And as time went on, it became harder and harder to find a way back. She took a shaky breath before continuing. David and I never had children. I told him I couldn't, but the truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of having a family with anyone but you, Jonathan. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Jonathan felt as if he were drowning in a sea of what-ifs and might-have-beens. Helena stood abruptly, pacing the room with nervous energy. This is insane. All of it. You let us believe you were dead for 17 years, and now you expect to just walk back into our lives? To reclaim what you threw away? Sophie's voice was small, filled with regret. I don't expect anything, Helena. I couldn't live with the lie anymore. When David died last year, I realized life was too short for regrets. I had to come back, to face the truth, no matter the consequences. Jonathan watched the interplay between the twins, struck by the stark contrast in their demeanors. Helena, all fire and barely contained fury. Sophie, a picture of remorse and quiet desperation. Both so alike in appearance, yet worlds apart in spirit. What about the fire? Jonathan asked suddenly, a thought occurring to him. If you weren't in the cabin, how did it start? Sophie's face paled, her eyes widening with a mix of fear and guilt. I didn't start the fire, if that's what you're asking. But I think I know who did. Helena and Jonathan exchanged a quick glance before turning back to Sophie, their curiosity piqued. Do you remember Thomas? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan nodded slowly. Thomas had been a friend of theirs, always on the periphery of their social circle. He had disappeared shortly after Sophie's supposed death, and no one had heard from him since. Thomas was obsessed with me, Sophie continued, her voice shaking. He'd been sending me letters, following me. I never told you because I didn't want to worry you. The night of the fire, I saw him lurking near the cabin. When I confronted him, he confessed that he'd started the fire to save me from marrying you. The revelation hit Jonathan like a physical blow. All these years, he'd blamed himself for the fire, convinced that his carelessness had cost Sophie her life. To learn that it had been deliberate arson, born of obsession and jealousy, was almost too much to bear. Helena's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with suspicion. And you're only telling us this now? After all these years? Sophie hung her head, shame evident in every line of her body. I was scared. Thomas threatened to hurt you both if I ever came forward. And after I ran, well, it seemed easier to let the past stay buried. Jonathan stood, running a hand through his hair in frustration. So Thomas is still out there? All this time, and you never thought to warn us? I'm sorry, Sophie whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I thought by staying away, I was keeping you safe. I never imagined he might still be a threat after all this time. The room fell into an uneasy silence as they all grappled with this new information. Jonathan felt as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly become unstable. Everything he thought he knew about his past called into question. Helena was the first to break the silence, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. I need some air. It's too much. Without waiting for a response, she strode out of the room, the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway. Jonathan watched her go, torn between following his wife and staying to hear more of Sophie's story. I should go after her, he said, half rising from his chair. Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes. Of course. I understand. I've caused enough trouble for one day. As Jonathan reached the door, he paused, turning back to look at Sophie. In that moment, he saw not the ghost of his past or the woman who had abandoned him, but someone fragile and human, weighted down by years of guilt and regret. We're not finished here, Sophie, he said softly. There's still so much to discuss, to understand. She met his gaze, a flicker of hope in her tear-filled eyes. I know, and I promise, no more secrets. Whatever happens, you deserve the whole truth. Jonathan nodded, then stepped out into the hallway, his mind reeling from everything he'd learned. As he searched for Helena, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. There were still so many questions unanswered, so many threads of their shared past left to unravel. He found Helena in the garden, standing amidst the blooming roses she'd so lovingly tended over the years. As he approached, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she touched a delicate petal. "Helena," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and the pain in her eyes nearly took his breath away. "Tell me it's not true, Jonathan. Tell me you're not considering that her return hasn't changed everything." Jonathan stepped closer, wanting desperately to comfort her but unsure how. "Helena, I don't know what to think right now. Everything's happened so fast." She laughed, a bitter sound that was so unlike her usual melodious tones. "Fast? She's been gone for 17 years, Jonathan. We've built a life together. Does that mean nothing now that your long-lost love has returned?" The accusation in her words stung, but Jonathan couldn't deny the kernel of truth in them. Sophie's return had awakened feelings he'd thought long buried, stirring up memories of a love that had once consumed his entire world. "Our life together means everything to me, Helena," he said, reaching for her hand. To his relief, she didn't pull away. "You've been my rock, my partner in every sense of the word. That doesn't just disappear overnight." Helena's eyes searched his face, looking for reassurance. "But you still love her, don't you? After all this time, after everything she's put us through." Jonathan felt torn, caught between honesty and the desire to protect Helena from pain. I don't know what I feel, Helena. Sophie was a huge part of my life, and her death nearly destroyed me. You know that better than anyone. But what we've built together, our love, our life, that's real too." Tears spilled down Helena's cheeks as she listened to his words. "So where does that leave us, Jonathan? Are we supposed to just welcome her back with open arms? Pretend the last 17 years never happened?" Before Jonathan could respond, a shout from the house caught their attention. They turned to see one of their staff members running towards them, his face pale with fear. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood, come quickly. It's Miss Sophie. She's collapsed." Jonathan felt his heart lurch in his chest. Without thinking, he started running towards the house, Helena close behind him. As they raced through the hallways, Jonathan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had happened to Sophie? Was it the stress of their confrontation, or something more sinister? And why, despite everything, did the thought of losing her again fill him with such overwhelming dread? As they burst into the study, they found Sophie lying unconscious on the floor, her face deathly pale. Jonathan fell to his knees beside her, cradling her head in his lap as Helena called for an ambulance. In that moment, as he held Sophie's limp form and felt Helena's worried gaze upon him, Jonathan realized that the choice before him was far more complex than he'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about choosing between past and present, between two loves. It was about unraveling the tangled web of secrets and lies that had bound them all together for so long. As the sound of sirens filled the air, Jonathan silently prayed for Sophie to be okay, even as he grappled with the guilt of that very wish. Whatever happened next, he knew that their lives would never be the same again. The ghosts of the past had risen, demanding to be acknowledged, and Jonathan found himself standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. The paramedics rushed in, their efficient movements a blur as they tended to Sophie. Jonathan stepped back, allowing them to work, and felt Helena's hand slip into his. Despite everything, she was still there, still supporting him. The gesture nearly broke him. As Sophie was loaded onto a stretcher, her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, locking onto Jonathan's. In that fleeting instant, he saw a mix of fear, regret, and something else. A secret yet untold. A truth still hidden. "Jonathan," Sophie whispered, her voice weak. "There's something I need to tell you." But before she could finish, her eyes rolled back, and she lost consciousness once more. The paramedics whisked her away, leaving Jonathan and Helena standing in the suddenly empty study, the echo of Sophie's unfinished sentence hanging in the air between them. As they rushed to follow the ambulance, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of yet another revelation, one that had the power to change everything once again. The day had started with the return of a ghost from his past, and now, as the sun began its descent towards the horizon, Jonathan found himself racing towards an uncertain future, caught between two women, two loves, and a truth that was still unfolding. Little did he know that the biggest shock was yet to come, a secret so profound that it would shake the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the intricate web of lies that had entangled them all for nearly 2 decades. The sterile white corridors of St. Mary's Hospital seemed to stretch endlessly before Jonathan as he paced back and forth, his mind a whirlwind of worry and confusion. Helena sat rigidly in a nearby chair, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, concern for her sister warring with the hurt and betrayal of Sophie's sudden reappearance in their lives. Hours had passed since they'd arrived at the emergency room, Sophie unconscious and pale on a stretcher. The doctors had whisked her away for tests, leaving Jonathan and Helena in a purgatory of uncertainty and unspoken tensions. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood? They both looked up to see a doctor approaching, his face unreadable. Jonathan felt his heart skip a beat as he braced himself for news. "How is she, doctor?" Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse with worry. The doctor's expression softened slightly. "Miss Sophie is stable now. She suffered from severe dehydration and exhaustion, likely brought on by extreme stress. We're keeping her for observation, but she should make a full recovery." Jonathan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Beside him, Helena's posture relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained guarded. "Can we see her?" Jonathan asked, already half turning towards Sophie's room. The doctor nodded. "She's awake and asking for you, Mr. Blackwood." "But," he hesitated, glancing at Helena. "She's requested to speak with you alone first." Helena stiffened, her eyes flashing with hurt and anger. "Of course she has," she muttered, her voice bitter. Jonathan turned to his wife, torn between his desire to see Sophie and his loyalty to Helena. "I don't have to go," Helena interrupted, her voice tight. "You need answers. We both do. Just remember who's stood by you all these years, Jonathan." With a heavy heart, Jonathan nodded and followed the doctor to Sophie's room. As he entered, he was struck by how small and vulnerable she looked in the hospital bed, a far cry from the vibrant woman he'd once known. Sophie's eyes fluttered open as he approached. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice weak. "You're here." He sat in the chair beside her bed, fighting the urge to take her hand. "Of course I'm here. You gave us quite a scare, Sophie." She attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry. For everything. For coming back and turning your life upside down. For not being strong enough to face the truth years ago." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice soft but intense. "Sophie, you said there was something else you needed to tell me. Something important. What is it?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she took a shaky breath. "Jonathan, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to change everything. And I'm so sorry for keeping it from you for so long." Heart pounding, Jonathan braced himself for whatever revelation was coming. "Tell me, Sophie, no more secrets, remember?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Jonathan, the night of the fire. The night I disappeared. I was pregnant." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Jonathan processed her words. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mean?" Sophie nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Yes, Jonathan. We have a daughter. Her name is Lily, and she's 16 years old." Jonathan felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. A daughter. He had a daughter he'd never known about, a child who had grown up without him for 16 years. The magnitude of this secret, of the time lost, hit him like a physical blow. How could you keep this from me?" He managed to choke out, his emotions a volatile mix of joy, anger, and overwhelming grief for the years he'd missed. Sophie's face crumpled with guilt and remorse. "I was scared, Jonathan. Scared of what Thomas might do if he found out, scared of facing you and Helena after what I'd done. By the time I realized how wrong I'd been, it seemed too late to undo the damage." Jonathan stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something to process this earth-shattering news. "Where is she? Lily. Where has she been all this time?" "She's with my aunt in Seattle," Sophie replied, her voice small. "She thinks David was her father. I never told her about you, about her real heritage. I thought I was protecting her, but now I see I was just being a coward." The weight of Sophie's words, of the years of deception and lost opportunities, crashed over Jonathan like a tidal wave. He had a daughter, a teenage daughter who didn't even know he existed. The thought was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. "I need to meet her," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. "I need to tell her the truth, to try and make up for all the time we've lost." Sophie nodded, relief evident in her eyes. "Of course. I want that too, Jonathan. She deserves to know her real father, to know the amazing man you are." As the implications of this revelation began to sink in, Jonathan's mind raced with questions and concerns. How would Lily react to learning the truth about her parentage? How would this affect his relationship with Helena? And what about the threat from Thomas? Was Lily in danger? Before he could voice any of these thoughts, a commotion outside the room caught his attention. He turned to see Helena burst through the door, her face a storm of emotions. "I heard everything," she said, her voice shaking. "A daughter, Sophie? You kept Jonathan's child from him for 16 years? Sophie's face paled even further as she faced her sister's wrath. "Helena, But Helena wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The damage you've caused? Not just to Jonathan, but to that poor girl who's been living a lie her entire life." Jonathan moved to stand between the sisters, feeling the weight of his role as mediator more heavily than ever. "Helena, please. I know this is a shock, believe me, I'm reeling too. But right now, we need to focus on what's best for Lily." At the mention of her niece's name, Helena's anger seemed to deflate slightly, replaced by a look of confusion and hurt. "Lily," she repeated softly. "I have a niece I never knew about. A niece who should have grown up with us, who should have been part of our family." Sophie's voice was small, filled with regret. "I'm so sorry, Helena. To both of you. I know I can never make up for the time I've stolen, but please let me try to make things right." The room fell into a heavy silence as the three of them grappled with the enormity of this revelation. Jonathan felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, the life he'd known crumbling beneath his feet, while a new, unknown future beckoned before him. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We need to go to Seattle. We need to meet Lily, to tell her the truth. She deserves to know her real family, to make her own choices about her future." Helena nodded slowly, her eyes meeting Jonathan's. In that moment, despite everything that had happened, he saw the strength and compassion that had made him fall in love with her all those years ago. "We'll go together," Helena said firmly. "As a family. Whatever happens next, we face it united." Sophie looked between them, hope and gratitude shining in her tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise, from this moment on, no more lies. No more secrets." As they began to discuss the logistics of their trip to Seattle, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in their intertwined lives. The revelation of Lily's existence had changed everything, opening up a world of possibilities and challenges he never could have imagined. He thought of the daughter he'd never known, wondering what she looked like, what her interests were, whether she had his eyes or Sophie's smile. The longing to meet her, to hold her and tell her how much she was loved and wanted, was almost overwhelming. But as he looked at Helena, steadfast and supportive despite her own pain, and at Sophie, fragile yet determined to make amends, Jonathan realized that the path forward would not be easy. Reconciling his past with Sophie, his present with Helena, and his newfound future as Lily's father would require all the strength, love, and forgiveness he could muster. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, casting long shadows across the room, Jonathan steeled himself for the journey ahead. Whatever challenges lay in store, whatever truths were yet to be uncovered, he was determined to face them head-on, for the sake of the daughter he'd just discovered and the family he was desperate to heal and protect. Little did he know that their trip to Seattle would unearth even more secrets, setting in motion a chain of events that would test the bonds of love, loyalty, and family in ways none of them could have ever anticipated. The truth about Lily was just the beginning, the real storm was yet to come. The private jet cut through the clouds, its sleek form carrying Jonathan, Helena, and Sophie westward towards Seattle. The cabin was thick with tension, each passenger lost in their own thoughts as they hurtled towards a meeting that would change all their lives forever. Jonathan stared out the window, watching the landscape below blur into a patchwork of greens and browns. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: excitement at the prospect of meeting his daughter, fear of her rejection, and a deep-seated anger at the years stolen from them both. Across the aisle, Helena sat rigidly, her face a mask of calm that belied the turmoil within. She had insisted on coming, despite Jonathan's offers to make this initial trip alone. "She's my niece," Helena had said firmly. "And whatever else has happened, we're still family." Sophie occupied the seat furthest from the others, her guilt a palpable presence in the cabin. She clutched a worn photo album in her lap, filled with pictures of Lily growing up, snapshots of a life Jonathan had missed, moments he could never reclaim. As the pilot announced their descent into Seattle, Jonathan broke the silence. "Sophie, tell us more about Lily. What is she like?" Sophie's face softened, a small smile playing at her lips. "She's amazing, Jonathan. Smart, kind, with a wicked sense of humor. She loves art, spends hours sketching and painting. And she's got your eyes, your determination." Jonathan felt his heart constrict at the description. A daughter who loved art, just as he did. A child with his eyes, his spirit. The reality of what he'd missed hit him anew, a fresh wave of grief and longing washing over him. Helena's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with barely contained emotion. "And she thinks David was her father? How could you let her believe that lie for so long, Sophie?" Sophie flinched at the accusation in her sister's tone. "I thought I was protecting her," she said softly. "From the truth about the fire, from the threat of Thomas. But I see now that I was just protecting myself. My own guilt, my own fears." The jet touched down with a gentle bump, taxiing to a private hangar where a sleek black car awaited them. As they disembarked, Jonathan felt a surge of nervous energy. In just a short while, he would be face to face with the daughter he'd never known existed. The drive to Sophie's aunt's house was tense, the Seattle rain pattering against the windows in a melancholy rhythm. Jonathan's mind raced with questions. How would Lily react to the truth? Would she hate him for not being part of her life? Could they ever make up for lost time? As they pulled up to a charming craftsman-style home, Sophie turned to Jonathan and Helena, her eyes pleading. "Please, let me speak to her first. Let me explain. Prepare her for meeting you both." Jonathan wanted to protest, his every instinct screaming to rush in and embrace the daughter he'd been denied for so long. But he forced himself to nod, understanding the need for delicacy in this fragile situation. They watched as Sophie walked up to the house, disappearing inside. The minutes stretched like hours as Jonathan and Helena waited in agonizing silence. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the front door opened. Sophie emerged, and behind her, Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. There she was, Lily, his daughter. She was beautiful, a perfect blend of him and Sophie. Her dark hair fell in waves around a face that was unmistakably familiar, with high cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw. But it was her eyes that struck him the most, his eyes, looking back at him with a mix of confusion, anger, and undeniable curiosity. As if in a trance, Jonathan stepped out of the car, Helena close behind him. He approached slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might cause Lily to bolt. "Lily," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'm Jonathan. I'm your father." Lily's eyes widened, darting between Jonathan and Sophie. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice shaking slightly. "Everything Mom just told me. About you, about David not being my real dad. Is it all true?" Jonathan nodded, fighting back tears. "Yes, it's true. Lily, I'm so sorry. If I had known about you, I would have moved heaven and earth to be part of your life." Lily's face crumpled, a mix of anger and confusion washing over her features. "But you didn't know, because she pointed accusingly at Sophie, kept me a secret. Lied to me my entire life." Sophie stepped forward, reaching for her daughter, but Lily jerked away. "Don't touch me," she cried. "How could you do this? How could you keep me from my real father?" The pain in Lily's voice cut through Jonathan like a knife. He wanted desperately to comfort her, to somehow make up for all the years they'd lost. But he knew that trust and forgiveness couldn't be forced or rushed. Helena, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of sympathy and barely contained emotion, finally spoke. "Lily," she said gently, "I'm Helena. I'm your aunt, and Jonathan's wife." Lily's gaze snapped to Helena, her eyes widening with fresh shock. "His wife? But I thought." "It's complicated," Jonathan said softly. "There's so much to explain, so much you need to know. But the most important thing, Lily, is that we're here now. We want to be part of your life, if you'll let us." For a long moment, Lily stood frozen, her eyes moving between the three adults who had suddenly upended her entire world. Then, without warning, she turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed in the quiet street, leaving Jonathan, Helena, and Sophie standing in stunned silence. The rain, which had slowed to a drizzle, picked up again, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the pain and confusion that hung in the air. Sophie moved to follow her daughter, but Jonathan gently caught her arm. "Give her some time," he said softly. It's a lot to process." Helena nodded in agreement, her voice tight with emotion. "We've had days to come to terms with this. Lily's entire world has just been turned upside down in a matter of minutes." As they stood there, uncertain of what to do next, the front door creaked open again. Lily reappeared, her eyes red-rimmed but her chin set in a determined line that Jonathan recognized all too well. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "No more lies, no more secrets. I deserve the truth, all of it." Jonathan felt a surge of pride at his daughter's strength, even as his heart ached for the pain she was going through. "You're right," he said softly. "You deserve the whole truth. And we'll tell you everything, I promise." Lily nodded, then stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter the house. As Jonathan followed her inside, with Helena and Sophie close behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and emotional journey. The truth was finally coming to light, but with it came a host of new challenges. How would they navigate this new family dynamic? Could the wounds of the past ever truly heal? And what of the lingering threat from Thomas, a shadow from the past that still loomed over their future? As they settled into the living room, ready to unravel the tangled web of their shared history, Jonathan silently vowed to do whatever it took to protect and nurture the relationship with the daughter he'd just found. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with tears and recriminations, but also with the potential for forgiveness, understanding, and a love that had been denied for far too long. Little did they know that their reunion was about to be interrupted by a shocking revelation that would once again test the fragile bonds they were trying to forge, and thrust them all into a danger none of them could have anticipated. The living room of Sophie's aunt's house was thick with tension as Jonathan, Helena, Sophie, and Lily sat facing each other. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows as if nature itself was trying to drown out the painful truths about to be revealed. Lily sat perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture rigid, eyes darting between the three adults who had turned her world upside down. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at composure. "I want to know everything." Jonathan leaned forward, his heart aching with the need to comfort his newfound daughter. "Lily," he began softly, "your mother and I, we were young and in love. We were engaged to be married, planning our future together." Sophie picked up the thread, her voice thick with emotion. "But there was someone else who was obsessed with me. A man named Thomas. He couldn't accept that I was with Jonathan." As Sophie recounted the events leading up to the fire, the threats from Thomas, and her decision to run away, Lily's eyes widened with a mix of horror and disbelief. Jonathan watched his daughter's face, seeing the myriad of emotions play across features that were so like his own. "So you just left?" Lily asked, her voice rising with anger as she turned to her mother. "You let everyone think you were dead? Let Dad believe he'd lost you forever?" Sophie flinched at the accusation in her daughter's tone. "I thought I was protecting everyone," she whispered. "I was young and scared, and I made a terrible mistake." Helena, who had been silent until now, spoke up. A mistake that cost all of us dearly, she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Jonathan nearly drank himself to death with grief. If I hadn't been there. She trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Jonathan reached out, taking Helena's hand in a gesture of gratitude and support. The action wasn't lost on Lily, whose brow furrowed as she observed the interaction. So you two. Lily gestured between Jonathan and Helena. You got together after Mom disappeared? Jonathan nodded, feeling the weight of the complicated emotions behind that simple gesture. Helena was there for me in my darkest moments, he explained. Over time, our friendship grew into something more. We've been married for 15 years now. Lily's gaze shifted to Helena, a mix of curiosity and wariness in her eyes. And how do you feel about all of this? She asked her newly discovered aunt. About Mom coming back, about me? Helena took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. It's been a shock, Lily. To all of us. But your family. Whatever else has happened, that doesn't change. I want to get to know you, to be part of your life if you'll let me. A small smile tugged at the corners of Lily's mouth, the first they'd seen since this emotional reunion began. But it quickly faded as she turned back to Sophie. Why did you wait so long to tell the truth? Why come back now? Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she reached for the photo album she'd brought. I wanted to tell you so many times, Lily. Every birthday, every milestone. I ached to share the truth with you, with Jonathan. But the longer I waited, the harder it became. She opened the album, revealing a photograph of a newborn Lily. When you were born, I almost called Jonathan. But I was so afraid. Afraid of what Thomas might do if he found out. Afraid of facing the consequences of my actions. Jonathan leaned in, his breath catching as he saw his daughter as a baby for the first time. The sight of what he'd missed, Lily's first steps, first words, first day of school, hit him like a physical blow. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I should have been there for all of it. If I had known. Lily's eyes softened slightly as she looked at her father. It's not your fault, she said quietly. You didn't know. Because she pointed at Sophie, her voice hardening again, chose to keep me a secret. Sophie nodded, accepting the blame. You're right, Lily. I made a terrible choice, and I can never fully make up for the time I've stolen from you and your father. But I'm here now, trying to make things right. When David died last year, I realized life was too short for secrets and regrets. I had to come back, to face the truth, no matter the consequences. As the weight of Sophie's words settled over the room, a sudden crash from outside made them all jump. Jonathan was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window to peer out into the rain-soaked darkness. What was that? Helena asked, her voice tense. Jonathan shook his head, squinting against the glare of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I don't see anything, probably just the wind knocking something over. But as he turned back to the group, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a primal instinct warning him of unseen danger. Lily, sensing the change in atmosphere, hugged herself tightly. You mentioned Thomas before, she said, her voice small. Do you think, could he still be a threat? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sophie paled visibly, while Helena's posture stiffened. Jonathan moved closer to Lily, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. We don't know, he said honestly, not wanting to frighten her but also unwilling to sugarcoat the potential danger. It's been many years, but if Thomas is still out there. He trailed off, the unspoken threat looming large in all their minds. Sophie reached out, taking Lily's hand in hers. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I never meant for any of this to touch you. I thought by staying away, I was keeping you safe. Lily didn't pull away from her mother's touch this time, a small sign of progress in their fragile relationship. What do we do now? She asked, looking between the three adults. Jonathan straightened, his jaw set with determination. We stay together, he said firmly. We face whatever comes as a family. No more secrets, no more running. Helena nodded in agreement, moving to stand beside her husband. Jonathan's right. Whatever issues we have to work through, whatever dangers we might face, we do it together. As they all murmured their agreement, another sound from outside caught their attention. This time, it was unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, moving towards the house. Jonathan's heart raced as he moved swiftly to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the property, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. But even in the dim light, Jonathan could make out the glint of something metallic in the person's hand. "Everyone, get down!" he shouted, just as a bullet shattered the window, sending glass flying across the room. Chaos erupted as they all dove for cover. Jonathan crawled towards Lily, shielding her with his body as more shots rang out. He could hear Helena's muffled cry of pain and Sophie's panicked breathing somewhere to his left. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, his mind racing to formulate a plan. "Is there a back door?" Sophie nodded, her face pale with fear. "Through the kitchen. There's a path that leads to the neighbor's yard." Jonathan made a split-second decision. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. Helena, can you move?" "Yes," came her strained reply. "It's just a graze. I'm okay." Relief flooded through him at her words. "Good. Sophie, you take Lily out the back. Helena and I will create a distraction. Meet us at the car in 5 minutes. If we're not there, take Lily and go. Don't look back." Lily's eyes widened with fear. "No, I'm not leaving you." Jonathan cupped his daughter's face, looking into eyes so like his own. "Lily, listen to me. I just found you. I'm not going to lose you now. Please, go with your mother. I promise I'll be right behind you." For a moment, Lily looked like she might argue further. But then she nodded, her jaw set in a determined line that reminded Jonathan so much of himself. As Sophie and Lily prepared to make their escape, Jonathan turned to Helena. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. Helena managed a grim smile, pressing a hand to her bleeding arm. "I've been through worse. Let's give this bastard something to think about." Jonathan nodded, his heart swelling with love and admiration for his wife's strength. Together, they formulated a quick plan to draw their attackers' attention away from Sophie and Lily's escape route. As another volley of shots rang out, shattering a vase and sending splinters of wood flying from the doorframe, Jonathan caught Sophie's eye. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever had happened in the past, whatever complicated emotions still existed between them, none of it mattered now. All that mattered was protecting their daughter. With a final nod, Sophie and Lily began their perilous journey towards the back door, staying low and using the furniture as cover. Jonathan watched them go, his heart in his throat, before turning back to Helena. "Ready?" he asked, grasping a heavy bronze statue from a nearby shelf. Helena nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. "Let's do this." In a coordinated move, they sprang into action. Helena overturned the heavy oak coffee table, creating a thunderous crash, while Jonathan hurled the statue through the already broken window. The sound of shattering glass filled the air as they shouted and made as much noise as possible. Their plan worked. The gunfire shifted, focusing on their position as Sophie and Lily slipped out the back door and into the rainy night. Jonathan's mind raced as he and Helena huddled behind their makeshift barricade. They needed to hold out for just a few more minutes, to give Sophie and Lily time to reach the car. But with each passing second, the danger grew. Suddenly, the gunfire ceased. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the steady patter of rain and their own ragged breathing. "Do you think he's gone?" Helena whispered, her face pale but determined. Before Jonathan could respond, a new sound reached their ears, the creak of the front door slowly opening. Their attacker was inside the house. Jonathan's heart pounded as he frantically searched for a weapon, anything to defend themselves against the approaching threat. His hand closed around a heavy brass candlestick just as a shadow fell across the doorway to the living room. Time seemed to slow as Jonathan prepared to face their assailant. But nothing could have prepared him for the shock of recognition as the figure stepped into view. "Thomas," he breathed, a mixture of anger and disbelief coursing through him. The man before them was older, his face lined and weathered, but unmistakably the same Thomas who had obsessed over Sophie all those years ago. His eyes gleamed with a manic light as he trained his gun on Jonathan and Helena. "Well, well," Thomas said, his voice rough with barely contained rage. "Isn't this a touching reunion? The grieving fiancé and his consolation prize, all grown up and playing happy families." Helena bristled at his words, but Jonathan placed a calming hand on her arm. He needed to keep Thomas talking, to buy time for Sophie and Lily to get safely away. "Why now, Thomas?" Jonathan asked, slowly rising to his feet with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "It's been 17 years. Why come after us now?" Thomas's laugh was bitter, edged with madness. "Why? Because she came back, didn't she? My Sophie. I've been watching, waiting all these years. And now she's here, trying to reclaim what was never hers to begin with." Jonathan's mind raced, trying to process this new information. Thomas had been watching them? For how long? The implications were terrifying. "Sophie made her choice, Thomas," Jonathan said carefully, acutely aware of the gun still pointed at them. "She chose me, all those years ago. And now she's chosen to come back, to make things right." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "No," he shouted, his grip on the gun tightening. "She was meant to be with me. I saved her from that fire, gave her a chance at a new life. And how does she repay me? By running back to you." The pieces suddenly fell into place in Jonathan's mind. "You," he said, his voice low with dawning horror. "You're the one who's been helping Sophie all these years. Keeping her hidden." Thomas's smile was a cruel twist of his lips. "I protected her," he snarled. "Kept her safe from you, from the life that would have destroyed her. And now." He raised the gun, his intent clear in his eyes. "Now, I'll finish what I started 17 years ago. I'll free Sophie from all of you, once and for all." As Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, several things happened at once. Helena launched herself at Jonathan, pushing him out of the line of fire. The deafening crack of the gunshot filled the air, followed immediately by the sound of shattering glass and screeching tires from outside. Jonathan's heart stopped as he realized what that meant. Sophie and Lily were at the car. They were in danger. With a surge of adrenaline, he tackled Thomas, wrestling for control of the gun. They crashed to the floor, grappling desperately as Helena struggled to her feet, her wounded arm hanging limp at her side. "Go," Jonathan shouted to his wife as he fought to keep Thomas pinned. "Get to the car, protect Lily." Helena hesitated for a split second, torn between helping her husband and saving their niece. But Jonathan's pleading look made the decision for her. With a final, anguished glance, she ran from the room, heading for the front door. As Jonathan struggled with Thomas, he could hear the sounds of chaos from outside. More gunshots, screaming, the revving of an engine. He prayed with every fiber of his being that Helena would reach them in time, that Sophie and Lily would be safe. With a surge of strength born of desperation, Jonathan managed to wrench the gun from Thomas's grasp, sending it skittering across the floor. But Thomas was far from defeated. With a roar of rage, he headbutted Jonathan, stars exploding behind his eyes as pain lanced through his skull. Dazed and struggling to maintain his hold, Jonathan felt Thomas's hands close around his throat. As his vision began to darken at the edges, a sudden calm washed over him. In that moment, facing what he thought might be his last, Jonathan's only thought was of Lily, the daughter he'd just found, the child he'd give anything to protect. With the last of his strength, Jonathan brought his knee up sharply, catching Thomas in the stomach. The man's grip loosened just enough for Jonathan to gulp in a precious breath of air and roll away. Scrambling to his feet, Jonathan made a dash for the discarded gun. But Thomas was right behind him, tackling him just as his fingers closed around the cold metal of the weapon. They crashed into a bookshelf, sending volumes raining down upon them as they grappled for control. In the struggle, the gun went off, the sound deafening in the confined space of the room. For a moment, everything went still. Then, slowly, Thomas slumped to the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Jonathan stood frozen, the smoking gun still in his hand, as he stared down at the man who had haunted their lives for so long. Thomas's eyes, wide with shock, met Jonathan's one last time before the light in them faded forever. The silence that followed was broken only by Jonathan's ragged breathing and the distant wail of approaching sirens. With a start, he remembered Sophie, Lily, and Helena. The danger wasn't over. Forcing his shaking legs to move, Jonathan stumbled out of the house and into the rain-soaked night. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. The car was gone, tire tracks carved deep into the muddy lawn. Scattered across the ground were shards of broken glass and spent bullet casings. And there, lying motionless on the wet grass, was a figure he recognized with heart-stopping clarity. "No," Jonathan whispered, his voice breaking as he ran towards the fallen form. "Please, no." As he dropped to his knees beside the body, a bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, casting a harsh light on the scene. In that brief, terrible moment, Jonathan saw the truth he'd been dreading. The face that stared up at him, pale and still in death, was his own. Jonathan recoiled in horror, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. How was this possible? How could he be looking at his own dead body? As the implications of what he was seeing began to sink in, a voice cut through the rain and the chaos of his thoughts. "Dad, Dad, wake up." Jonathan's eyes snapped open, his heart racing as he gasped for air. He found himself back in the living room of Sophie's aunt's house, surrounded by concerned faces. Lily was shaking his shoulder, her eyes wide with worry. "Dad, are you okay? You passed out for a minute there," Lily said, her voice trembling. Jonathan blinked, trying to orient himself. The vivid nightmare of the gunfight, Thomas, and seeing his own dead body faded away as reality reasserted itself. There had been no attack, no car chase, no deaths. It had all been a terrifying hallucination. I'm all right," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Just got a bit overwhelmed, I guess." Helena knelt beside him, her face etched with concern. "You gave us quite a scare, Jonathan. One minute you were talking, and the next you just collapsed." Sophie appeared with a glass of water, which Jonathan gratefully accepted. As he sipped the cool liquid, he noticed the worry lines on everyone's faces. "I'm sorry," he said, setting the glass down. "I think the stress of everything just caught up with me. I had this incredibly vivid dream, I suppose. It felt so real." Lily sat down next to him, hesitantly taking his hand. "What happened in the dream, Dad?" Jonathan shook his head, not wanting to burden them with the details of his horrific vision. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that we're all here, safe, and together." As the adrenaline from his nightmare faded, Jonathan found himself looking at their situation with new eyes. The dream, as terrifying as it had been, had crystallized something for him. The importance of family, of forgiveness, and of facing the future together. He turned to Sophie, his expression softening. "Sophie, I know we have a lot to work through, but I want you to know that I forgive you. What's done is done, and dwelling on the past won't change it. What's important now is building a future for Lily, for all of us." Sophie's eyes welled with tears as she nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Jonathan. I promise, no more secrets, no more running. We'll face whatever comes together." Helena squeezed Jonathan's hand, a small smile on her face. "I agree. It won't be easy, but we're family. We'll figure it out." Lily looked between the three adults, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. "So, what happens now? Where do we go from here?" Jonathan pulled his daughter into a gentle hug, his heart swelling with love for this young woman he was just getting to know. "Now, we take it one day at a time. We get to know each other, build trust, and create new memories to replace the ones we've lost." As they sat there, this newly formed and still fragile family unit, Jonathan felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and a lifetime of catching up to do. But for the first time since Sophie's return, he felt truly hopeful about the future. The rain outside began to let up, a faint rainbow appearing in the distance as the sun peeked through the clouds. It seemed like a sign, a promise of brighter days ahead. "I think," Jonathan said, looking at each of them in turn, "that it's time we went home. All of us. Together." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Jonathan couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns life had taken. From loss to rediscovery, from anger to forgiveness, they had weathered a storm that could have torn them apart. Instead, it had brought them together, stronger and more united than ever before. Walking out into the fresh, rain-washed air, with Lily by his side and Helena and Sophie following close behind, Jonathan felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and a new chapter was beginning, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future where no one had to face their struggles alone. As they drove away from Sophie's aunt's house, leaving behind the shadows of secrets and lies, Jonathan knew that their story was far from over. But whatever twists and turns lay ahead, they would face them as they should have all along, as a family.